No, that's fine. I had a question about,
Great.
is that too loud?
No. Great.
About like distant ed, because like there's the distant ed pharmacy, and then we have an on-campus pharmacy, and they strive to have the same experience for the degree. And so I guess my question is, what about non-traditional students with doing it online if they need accommodations? Like a bigger screen or the software isn't quite working for them? And I just...
Yes, to all that.
Okay.
We've worked with distance ed students specifically from the School of Allied Health in the past. And we may even have somebody currently we're working with, I believe in New Mexico or something like that. Denise is looking at papers and stuff. So we've allowed for and accommodated the extra time and did some review of coursework that they were required to do in terms of papers, that sort of thing. So yes, we are involved in that. Denise coordinates most of that kind of outreach. So if you have a question about that, please contact her at 2166.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. I have two questions for Wade. I'll ask them, then you can respond. First, of the 209 students that you identified that have presented themselves with a disability, if you will, learning challenge, what percentage of those would you expect would complete their degree requirements and graduate from the university? And secondly, for those students that request and are given note takers, is there any liability on the note taker regarding the student's success?
That's an interesting question. We don't keep precise graduation data. It's probably something we should do. But anecdotally, I would just say that the students, if they're using their accommodations on a consistent basis, are successful here. And a significant number do graduate. And I think the number would be relatively high. And so that's probably something we should look at. But Denise, would you agree? I mean, it's
those numbers, Wade.
Yeah. We do?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. That was a 0% day, I guess.
I would say roughly the last set of numbers I remember is about 27% of the students who disclosed did not actually earn a degree. No, you know what? It's actually lower than that. What I do is I run a list of students who leave each year and why they leave. And that list is only about 4 or 5, 6, 7 students each semester. What I have is about 27% of the students who disclose but do not use accommodations graduate. The rest are using accommodations.
So in general, I think that we're fairly successful. The note-taker question is an interesting question. And I don't know the real answer to that in terms of a liability issue, but we haven't got any complaints so far. We normally ask the student at the end of the semester if the note-taking that they had received was sufficient for them in terms of the class. So they do kind of a general evaluation of the note-taking process. So we do that. And based on that information, we either go ahead and acknowledge the service of the note-taker or not. So it depends on what the student says, but generally there's not been a problem with that. So strict liability, I don't know.
No, this time. Just to add to that, if the student is receiving notes and they're not sufficient, I hear about it. They'll come and say, I can't read these notes, or they're not good, or I'm not getting them. And then I either find a new note taker or clear up the misunderstanding. Some students don't, after they agree to be note takers, they're not always sure about, well, where do I put these so that my student can get them. but we don't hold them liable any more than you would hold a study buddy liable for the grade. And we've only had a few cases where we've had to find another note taker. So I do rely on the student receiving that. We give them a small stipend for doing that.
Ladies first.
Perhaps the question is directed to Amy. If there is a higher or there will be a higher percentage of students with disabilities in the future, and there will be an increase in the number of students who go abroad who will fall in that category. And again, if the focus is going to shift to the provision of accommodations, what happens? What increased responsibility, or what increased, how can I say, decisions we would have to make sure that students who participate in our programs abroad or any other programs abroad, for example, the students who volunteer, who go elsewhere during spring break to do service in the communities, how does that affect us who are involved in such programs?
That's a great question, Maria, and I hadn't thought about the broadening of the ADA in the context of study abroad. But what we've looked at to date is that the ADA per se does not apply to study abroad. I don't think that will change under the ADA Amendment Act. And the place that's really come up most often for study abroad so far has been usually the fact that places are not necessarily handicapped accessible abroad. And one of the things that we've done, I think, is made sure that students understand that if they are going abroad, they may not find the same kinds of accommodations and support that they would find if they were studying in the United States. So I think that's probably what we'll have to continue to do, is to make sure people understand what they may expect in a study abroad program, but at the same time look at whether, with the broadening of the ADA, whether that'll have an impact on study abroad programs. So that's a great question.
Okay, hello. Oops. Yeah, I have a couple questions. One is, if you suspect, like a student or say an employee that works for you that might have a disability doesn't come forth, what's the process for that? And then the second part is, you listed a lot of different things that might be disability. You didn't list them, you talked about them, like different illnesses or physical conditions. And is there like a list out there? I'm thinking things like migraine headaches, diabetes, that sort of thing. Is there a list of is there a list in this law that says this is a disability or this isn't? Or do we have to just kind of guess?
There's not a list. I mean, the list is the definition, a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So there's not a list. I think that the heart of your question is, if you think somebody has a disability, what are you supposed to do? And the law hasn't changed that. It's still the responsibility of the person who may have the disability to come forward and ask for a reasonable accommodation, okay? If somebody doesn't come forward, then we don't have, and we should not approach them and say, okay, you're having performance issues. Is this all because you have a disability? We should focus on the objective behaviors that we're seeing. What's important, and I didn't get into it today, but there's a whole new ADA guidance that talks about performance and conduct standards in the context of ADA disabilities. And that basically says, if you're going to talk to somebody who's having performance issues and all of a sudden they say, well, that's because I have a disability, then what the EEOC is saying is, go ahead and have that conversation with them about their performance, but at the same time then start that interactive discussion with them about, we're going to go ahead and give you this written warning, but let's talk about reasonable accommodations going forward. So I think it's important, and I think from a Creighton perspective, this is sometimes hard for us to do, because we have a tendency to think, okay, there must be some reason this person is having performance issues, and sometimes we may want to inquire into what are those reasons. That's really not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to identify performance issues, talk about those performance issues. If that leads to a discussion about a disability, that can happen, but it's not our job to go out and try to ask people if they need accommodations. We need to put it on our website. If you need an accommodation, go talk to HR, go talk to your manager. We need to make people know where to go, but at the same time, then it becomes their responsibility to ask for those accommodations.
The only thing I'd add to that, I just don't think there's any substitute for good communication between managers and their employees. I think if we encourage that, I think issues then are, it gives the employee an opportunity to share whatever the issues are with their manager.
So should I ask somebody, "Hi, Amy, how you doing?" And then you tell me, do I suddenly have a disclosure?
Yeah, I think we're going to be to the point where we can't have conversations with people. Lennis, I mean, I actually was thinking about that a little bit in the context of, so if you have something like that, you have a conversation and you say, "How are you?" and suddenly you hear about, I have health issues, I have this, I have that. I think at that point in time, I would say, it sounds like you may be asking for or needing a reasonable accommodation. I would use those words, I think, and if they say, "Yes, I am," then I would say, "Okay, let's set up an appointment. Why don't you and I go down and see the HR person and talk about how we would move forward on that." What I wouldn't do is I wouldn't just ignore the conversation. I don't know, there you are. Does that make sense?
This is for the counseling center. In regards to what Amy is talking about, how do you guys handle if you find out that somebody does come across and you find out that they do have a disability? I'm assuming you guys are have the patient confidentiality thing going on, but do you just try to help them, or do you tell anybody on campus about the disability this person may have?
Generally, what we end up doing is working with them, having them sign a release of information, and coordinate with Wade or Denise and figure out what we need to do to go from there.
Mike and Kevin, probably because of my ADD, I'm not sure. You may have said this already. But if a faculty person recognizes that there may be a need, what should they do?
Well, if a faculty person thinks that a student may have a learning disability, they should talk to the student and encourage the student to come into the counseling service and ask that question, to request some kind of assessment for whether that's true or not. So the faculty member should, if the faculty member also accompanies that suggestion with a call to the counseling service saying, "Heads up, I'm sending so-and-so in for a learning problem that makes us more alert, but we would deal with it in any case if the student comes in and requests an assessment for a learning disorder." Does that answer?
So if a student comes to your office, does he automatically get some sort of relief in taking tests? Anything like that?
No. To get the accommodations, they would have to go through the process of us evaluating them to identify that that disability exists, and they do require those accommodations. Denise, did you have something you wanted to add?
I think your question, Lennis, is kind of a fuzzy one in a sense that we think of the counseling service as a place that provides relief. Do you get any relief from taking psychological tests? Well, the answer is no. They aren't in time to make you feel better, although they're kind of fun to take. So we really have two functions there. One is, yes, we do provide counseling services, and we hope we can relieve distress. But the other side is we're performing an assessment, and that's a more objective, is it there or not there kind of question that we're attempting to answer, and that's a different service from relief.
Jeff, what role does the EAP play in this?
Well, I think, we're very fortunate. Magellan's our EAP provider, and I think they provide a confidential resource to employees, not necessarily just for disabilities, but just to help them sort through whatever challenges they may be facing on the job. And EAP is a great resource to call about any workplace topic. If you're having, how do I disclose if I feel I have a disability? How would I approach my employer? Would be a great question to ask our EAP. I think you could also ask that to the HR department without feeling any, concerns, what's confidential concerns. But the EAP is a great resource. A lot of documentation on the website, and which is on the HR website.
We have students who will self-disclose disabilities through the application process. Is it something that we should do in a proactive way to make them aware of how they should be requesting accommodations or where they might be able to find support? Because obviously that isn't part of their admission decision, but we're not doing anything proactively to reach out to those students who are self-identifying themselves as having issues or challenges in the past.
If we know that the student has self-disclosed and has been accepted and attending the university, then we'd be happy to meet with them, and we do that quite frequently. And you certainly could go ahead and give them our contact information. If they want to set up an appointment to meet with us before the semester begins, that would be ideal, rather than waiting till they get here. So that would be one proactive approach. But please send them, if you know and they're accepted, go ahead and let them know that our office, on the 4th floor would be happy to meet with them, and we do that regularly. Okay? Yes.
I would like to go back to an implicit question raised about international programs. You asked the question in terms of accommodations for students working abroad, which go through the International Student Office. The other thing that you even do more of is helping international students make good adjustments at the university. And one of the problems international students often have is language problems. English is not their first language. It may be their second or their third language. And they take the TOEFL. They take training in English, and they take the TOEFL to see if they're fluent in English enough to take classes. However, they often encounter the same dilemma that a learning disabled student encounters when they actually try to take tests that are timed. They're taking tests in English. They're taking tests that are time to be done in a certain period of time. And because English is not their first language, they may be translating in their heads as they go through the test to their native language, and it takes them longer to get through a given period of testing than it might take someone whose English is their first language. So I would just raise the question for faculty members, and I'm using this as a soapbox because this is one of my issues. How important is a time limit on tests, really? If you're writing tests for students, how important is it that you write a test that tests their ability to get it done in 50 minutes? I would raise the notion that you're testing two things when you write a test that can only be done in 50 minutes. You're testing what they know, and you're testing how quickly they can read English. And really, if you want to know what they know, give them the time it takes for them to answer the question, even if English is not their first language or if reading slow is one of their difficulties. Because in the end, what you're looking for, it seems to me, is what they know. So that's just, I don't know if you get a lot of complaints from international students about that, but we do get a lot of complaints from students who have a slowness in reading that's not a disability-based slowness, but they're just not quick readers. And it seems to me faculty often can confuse and not know when they get a low score whether it was a problem with quick reading or a problem with lack of knowledge. Well, if we can frame it, if we can get the student to talk about the problem with us in a place where we can address it, we would immediately begin to have them talk about why they don't want to disclose it. What is it from their culture that leads them to be reluctant to disclose it? And we would try to say, well, you know, in this culture you don't need to worry about it in that same way, and actually there's some benefits for disclosing it. And so we would kind of work with the differences in cultures so that they might feel more comfortable in coming forward with whatever their disability is. Because we do find that in cultures, you know, but a lot of those same cultures don't darken the door of counseling centers either for the same reason, that it's just not part of how they seek help or how they resolve problems. Does that help? We try to run at the problem and frame it differently, you know, and say, okay, you have this reluctance for very legitimate and understandable reasons, but it works against you here. How can we make this easier for you? Yeah.
Actually, I have two questions. First, both of them have to do with the employer-employee relationship. I'm wondering, is there a requirement, an internal Creighton requirement for department and division level managers to attend things like this, to become aware of their responsibilities with regard to ADA?
I think, let me answer. I attempt to answer the first one. No, there's not a formal requirement. Typically, I believe we cover the ADA pretty well during the Foundations for Effective Supervision, which is one of the university's education offerings for managers and supervisors. We've looked at some other ways of trying to, you know, really make sure every manager and every supervisor goes through that, and we just haven't probably been as thorough as we should have been. But I think also, You know, sometimes some of the new laws around the ADA, and especially the new law, the ADA, the amendments, it's very complex. And I would, at some point in time, you have to really ask yourself, do we want to try to train 500 managers in the nuances of the law, or do we want to have them just be aware of the basics of it and make sure they can get referred to a subject matter expert who can help them? So we've leaned more toward the latter than the former.
Well, my second question is there a different standard that Creighton uses for discussion and conversation between faculty and students versus employers, managers, and their employees? And the reason I ask that is it sort of sounds like it's okay for a faculty member to gently approach a student and inquire with regard to their performance if there might be other issues to bear. But I heard, and maybe I'm wrong, I heard that that a manager should not gently begin a conversation with an employee about that. And that seems to me that the standard should be the former for both instances, that it's okay for a supervisor to gently inquire if there's something that can be done to help the employee's performance in the spirit of, you know, the Creighton ideal of service for others, et cetera.
You ask a great question. Gently inquire is probably the words that, you know, you start traipsing into some employment law. So I think there's a different relationship, first of all, between a student and a faculty and an employee and employer. There's a lot of different relationships and different laws that rule how we treat each other in those circumstances. So I think gently inquire, I think our course of action should always be to encourage communication between the manager and the employee, which would then allow the employee, if they're having issues or have concerns about their ability to perform the functions, would allow them to bring forth those concerns and allow then the manager and the university to take action. I think where Amy's concern is we shouldn't just go around asking people. First of all, it may be a confidentiality issue, but the employee may not want to disclose certain things about what they may be experiencing from a disability standpoint, or maybe they're not sure at that point. So I think we just need to be very careful, and I think the faculty to student and employer to employer ratio are just distinctly different in some ways.
We've reached the end of our time here. Some of you have other appointments, but we're not going to quit. I just saw a hand come up over here. So, but for those of you that need to go, thanks for being here. I hope you got something out of this. We sure enjoyed putting it on for you.